There's a place in UK where men die more than 10 years earlier than the national average. In another, 90% of a single ward is classed as income-deprived. These are not the worst slums of a century ago. This is Britain in 2026, and these are the 12 poorest places in the country. I've ranked the 12 most deprived places in the United Kingdom for 2026 and where you'd actually want to live in each one. Comparing deprivation across the United Kingdom is harder than it sounds because the four nations each use their own measure and none of them line up neatly. What I've done is judge each place against the worst bracket within its own nation, then layer in housing costs, unemployment, child poverty, life expectancy, Office for National Statistics wellbeing data, and the unfiltered view from locals. Let's find out what life there is actually like. Starting with Knowsley, its problem is a contradiction. The 2025 English indices of deprivation put employment deprivation at 23%, meaning nearly a quarter of working-age adults are shut out of the labour market against their will, and yet the housing market hasn't followed the local economy down. By April 2026, the average house price had reached £193,000, up 3.8% on the year, and private rents had climbed 6.1% to £814 a month. With local incomes flat and housing costs rising, the squeeze shows up in a child poverty rate close to 32% across the wider northwest once housing is paid for. Residents describe Knowsley as a peripheral borough living in Liverpool's shadow, but that isolation breeds a tight local loyalty, and ONS figures bear it out. Life satisfaction sits below the baseline, while trust and community cohesion outperform far wealthier areas in the south. The lasting scar is multi-generational worklessness, something successive councils have struggled to shift. Antisocial behaviour is a known concern around Stockbridge Village, while the edge near Prescott is rated by locals as the steadiest place to settle. For a pensioner downsizing here, the capital needed is high for a deprived area. Male life expectancy stands at 77.5 years, nearly 2 below the national figure, and the poorest tenth of households get by on £16,000 to £27,000 a year after housing. It's a milder strain of a much harder story, the collapse of heavy industry that has hollowed out the next town on the list.
Grimsby is what happens when an industry leaves and the public services go with it. The town sits inside northeast Lincolnshire, which the 2025 IMD places among the most deprived 1% of areas in the country, the worst of it packed into the East Marsh ward. Property values reflect the stall. The average home cost £150,000 in April 2026, up a marginal 1.3%, while rents are suppressed at £618 a month. In East Marsh, almost a quarter of residents live in fuel poverty, alongside the lowest life expectancy and the highest crime rates in the borough, with nuisance noise and serious fly tipping the day-to-day reality. Child poverty is severe, with 30.8% of children in absolute low-income families. Residents are sharply aware of the town's national reputation and talk about the fading fishing trade, now replaced by a kind of economic apathy. The region is a major hub for the offshore wind industry, but those jobs are technical and the money rarely reaches the working-class population. For a retiree on a fixed state pension, the rock-bottom property prices make it viable, but the state of local services carries real risk. ONS wellbeing data records raised anxiety and lower happiness than the wider region. The port's location was once everything, much like the city further up the coast, where geography both made the place and now boxes it in.
Hull carries a contradiction in its own well-being figures. Its year as UK City of Culture lifted civic pride and measurable local happiness. yet the underlying economic anxiety never left the record. Geography has always cut Hull off, leaving a self-contained microeconomy that sits near the top of the national deprivation tables. The 2025 IMD ranks it the fourth most deprived local authority by the share of its LSOAs in the worst 10% nationally. Economic exclusion runs deep, pushing child poverty to 33.2%. There's no reliable median house price for the most deprived wards without regional distortion, but rents jumped 5.6% in the year to 2026 to £674 a month, narrowing affordability for the lowest earners. Residents grumble endlessly about traffic and bottlenecks, but defend the city's character with a fierce, sardonic loyalty, rejecting outside talk of urban failure. For anyone retiring, Hull is a mixed offer. The city is flat and easy to get around for those with declining mobility, and the cost of living is low against the national median. The catch is the isolation, stuck at the end of the M62, with the Humber estuary blocking the route south, which limits access to specialist healthcare for those managing age-related conditions. That sense of a place set apart runs even deeper in the next city, where division was drawn into the streets themselves. Belfast's poverty can't be read without its history. Under the NIMDM 2017, the baseline measure for the region, the wards of Waterworks 2, New Lodge 2 and Ardoyne in North Belfast rank among the most deprived in Northern Ireland, while the Belfast West constituency holds the highest concentration of deprivation overall. Housing is under acute pressure. Private rents across Northern Ireland reached £871 a month by late 2025, up 6.4%, with average house prices at £193,000. The biggest barrier to recovery is the lingering infrastructure of division, with interface areas geographically penned in and economic movement restricted. Health inequality is severe. Male life expectancy in the Belfast district is just 76.5 years, and rates of mental health crisis run high, tied to intergenerational trauma. Residents describe a dual city, the Cathedral and Titanic quarters drawing international money, while the outer estates are left behind. And the single hardest reality is the grip of paramilitary influence over local justice and housing. Yet the retirement and happiness picture cuts the other way. With 15% overall poverty and 24% child poverty across the wider region, the material hardship is real, but social capital cushions it. That same gap between deep need and stubborn community pride defines a very different landscape in the South Wales valleys. Next, Tredegar shows the long tail of single industry collapse. The WIMD 2025 confirms that 20% of Blaenau Gwent's small areas sit in the most deprived 10% of Wales, with Tredegar Central and West prominent among them. The housing market reflects a local affordability crunch. Average prices in Blaenau Gwent hit £142,000 in April 2026 after an 8% annual surge, while rents rose 7% to £674 a month. The defining weakness is health. The legacy of heavy industry, combined with modern economic inactivity, has driven male life expectancy down to around 73.8 years. And the steep valley terrain makes the area genuinely hostile to retirees or anyone with limited mobility, a problem worsened by repeated cuts to municipal transport. Sirhowy too stands out for concentrated multi-domain deprivation, and child poverty matches the severe Welsh average of 33%.
But the place can't be judged on economics alone. ONS happiness data captures the split: strong attachment and cultural identity sitting alongside deep anxiety about the future. This is the birthplace of Aneurin Bevan and the cradle of the National Health Service, which makes its present struggle to provide basic primary care an uncomfortable irony. Health, though, becomes something stranger across the border in Scotland, a pattern of early death the experts still can't fully explain.
The hardest fact about Glasgow's poorest wards is the Glasgow effect. It's a level of excess mortality that socio-economic status alone doesn't account for. Culton and Easterhouse are the centre of this health crisis, where a legacy of violent crime and chronic substance dependency are still live concerns. The Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation 2020 marks 44% of Glasgow's data zones as among the 20% most deprived in Scotland, a systemic urban poverty, and the housing market only deepens the exclusion. By May 2026, private rents across Greater Glasgow had surged to £1,272 a month, far ahead of local income growth, while the average property price of £187,000 hides extreme swings between rich and poor postcodes. For a retiree, the barriers are clear. High rents block easy downsizing, and the urban density is hard going for anyone on a state pension. Set against that, Glasgow holds some of the highest cultural capital in the UK, with the West End and Merchant City acting as cosmopolitan counterweights. Residents protect the city fiercely, using dark humour to skewer the council while celebrating its music and arts. ONS data shows the same split: high anxiety but flashes of happiness and purpose that outdo quieter, wealthier districts. The wreckage of industry tells a blunter story a little further down the coast.
Next, Middlesbrough is a concentration point of disadvantage in the northeast. Residents come across as worn down by national stereotyping, but unsparing about their own council. The mood is defensive against southern media portrayals, yet locals readily call the town centre a zone of decline, pointing to visible substance abuse. Even so, ONS data suggests that while long-term life satisfaction is low, the daily back and forth of community life, carried by a blunt regional humour, provides a real psychological buffer. Independent corners like Baker Street and areas such as Nunthorpe get held up as proof of grassroots survival. The stagnation is severe, with an employment deprivation score of 23.3% and a child poverty rate above 42%. Costs are correspondingly low. Average rents sit around £674 a month, actually down 0.5% on the year, and no reliable median house price captures the gulf between the inner terraces and the affluent suburban fringe. The defining reality is the tracts of post-industrial wasteland cutting the urban core off from any revival, alongside a shocking health gap. Retirees are pulled in by cheap property and the nearby North York moors, including Roseberry Topping, but face a healthcare trust under heavy multi-morbidity demand. Collapse of an old economy has an even more visible cousin further round the coast, where it was the seaside trade that went.
Blackpool is an extreme outlier in British demographics. The 2025 IMD confirms that 7 of the 10 most deprived neighbourhoods in all of England sit inside this one local authority. Its housing market is uniquely distressed, with an average price of £134,882, dropping to £109,000 in inner Blackpool, and rents at £752 a month. The engine of the deprivation is the collapse of domestic tourism, which left a glut of former guest houses now converted into houses in multiple occupation, drawing a transient, vulnerable population into inner wards such as Bloomfield and Claremont. That churn fuels severe public health outcomes, life expectancy of 75.8 years, and some of the highest avoidable mortality and child poverty rates in the country at 35.6%. Crime in the inner wards is driven by the nighttime economy and seasonal influxes, which makes the centre tough for permanent residents, and the institutionalised transience steadily erodes any lasting community. Yet the retirement and happiness figures complicate the picture. Long a retirement haven, Blackpool still offers real affordability for pensioners, plus civic assets like Stanley Park and the Promenade. But the town is treated with a mix of tragedy and affection, one user calling a visit a natural antidepressant simply for proving things could be worse. From a faded English resort, the trail of seaside decline crosses the water to the remote northwest of Northern Ireland. On the remote northwestern edge of Northern Ireland, the Derry city and Strabane district faces deep economic isolation. Under the NIMDM 2017, the East Strabane super output area ranks as the single most deprived unit in the nation, with Crever 2 close behind. Property remains accessible against the UK average, with a provisional house price of £185,000 in early 2026 and rents averaging £799 a month. The defining reality is demographic exclusion and a chronic lack of infrastructure. More than half, 54.7% of young people in the district live in deprivation, more than double the Northern Ireland average, driven by an economic inactivity rate reaching 30%. For retirees, the picture splits sharply. The area holds remarkable historical and environmental assets, the 17th century walls, the Peace Bridge and the Culmore Edge, and the cost of living is manageable, but male life expectancy in the most deprived wards falls to 72.3 years, 5.7 below the council average. Residents argue the Northwest is deliberately starved of infrastructure and university funding in favour of Belfast, and that shared anger feeds an unusually strong community spirit. ONS equivalent data shows a fiercely independent cultural identity and immense social capital, proof that economic deprivation, with local poverty at 24%, doesn't equal cultural or psychological poverty. That same loss of people and purpose takes a more terminal form back across in Scotland. This one is a high-risk proposition for retirees, Greenock oddly tempting one. A pensioner selling up in a high-value southern market could buy a Victorian property here outright for a fraction of the cost and keep a substantial sum, with areas like the Esplanade offering striking waterfront views and historic custom house architecture. The talk centres on the painful gap between Greenock's natural setting and its crumbling municipal infrastructure, praising the warmth of those who remain while mourning the loss of shipbuilding. The town, inside Inverclyde, has been shaped by chronic economic contraction and people leaving. In the SIMD 2020, a data zone in Greenock town centre was named the single most deprived area in all of Scotland. The housing numbers show the lack of demand. The average sold price in the 12 months into 2026 was £153,543, with flats averaging just £98,305, and no reliable private rent figure exists that isn't skewed by social housing, where rents run around £90 a week. The existential threat is depopulation.
Inverclyde is projected to keep losing working-age residents, prompting analysts to call it the least financially viable place to live in Scotland, given the gap between low median household incomes of around £25,044 and a shrinking tax base. As the young and economically active leave for Glasgow or Edinburgh, the services left behind strain to support an ageing population. Coastal decline reads differently again in North Wales, where a grand Victorian resort has tipped into something far harder. Rhyl's fall from premier Victorian resort to entrenched hardship is a textbook case of coastal failure. The WIMD 2025 names Rhyl West 2 the single most deprived small area in Wales, a position it has held across multiple iterations of the index. Despite that, the wider property market is unexpectedly active, with average house prices at £199,500, propped up by outside investment and retirement migration rather than local wages, and no reliable private rent median survives the distortion from holiday-let conversions. The harshest reality is the meeting point of high crime and deep local poverty. The overall crime rate in 2021 was 186 crimes per 1,000 people, 54% above the regional average, making specific central wards along the West Parade statistically hazardous. Deprivation grips the high street, where 88% of the population in Rhyl West 2 is income-deprived, and short-term regeneration projects have repeatedly failed to build a sustainable second economy. For retirees, Rhyl is double-edged. The coastline and the nearby Clwydian Range, out toward the Rutland border, are a genuine draw, but the influx of holiday homes has gutted the winter economy, creating a ghost town effect that isolates residents and stretches local healthcare. The sentiment is polarized. Outsiders deride the town, but residents defend it hard, with a shared view that the built environment is crumbling, while the people are, in one phrase, 90% nice, normal people. This leaves one place above all the rest, the most deprived neighbourhood in England.
Jaywick is a one-off in British planning, an area whose origins as a 1930s plotland holiday resort for working-class Londoners effectively doomed it to long-term deprivation. The 2025 IMD confirms that the area east of Jaywick and St Osyth in Tendring remains the single most deprived neighbourhood in England, a status held continuously through the 2010, 2015 and 2019 indices. The housing stock is mostly unmortgageable, lightly built chalets, so detached bungalows routinely list between £90,000 and £140,000, with rents heavily suppressed at around £650 a month. The defining reality is the near-total lack of basic municipal infrastructure. The Brooklands and Grasslands estates have unadopted potholed roads, no mains gas, and serious exposure to coastal flooding. Health outcomes are devastating, with life expectancy in the wider Tendring deprivation zones 10.6 years lower for men than the national average. For retirees, Jaywick is the most extreme version of the affordable coastal model, completely flat and exceptionally cheap, pulling in pensioners on the lowest fixed incomes who are priced out of the conventional market. The paradox runs deep. For all the material poverty, ONS data and local studies record an intense village-like social cohesion. The chalets get described as post-apocalyptic, but the locals' fierce, defensive pride is what comes through. Jaywick is a community abandoned by economics and planning, and held together almost entirely by the resilience of the people who live there.
These places show poverty arriving by very different routes. The collapse of the domestic seaside resort in Blackpool, Rhyl and Jaywick,
The withdrawal of heavy industry and maritime trade in Tredegar, Grimsby, Greenock, and Middlesbrough, and the scars of geographic and geopolitical isolation in Belfast, Derry, and Hull. For retirees, each is a volatile offer. Exceptional affordability set against failing infrastructure, fuel poverty, and stark health inequality. And the gap between housing costs and local incomes, visible even in Knowsley, points to a failure of affordability that ignores regional boundaries. Whether the latest housing and levelling up policies can shift these entrenched divides is the question the next decade will have to answer.